Hello and welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds with your host Marie Mullaney. Today I have a very special interview to bring you all with the author Jacqueline Carey of the Kushiel Legacy series. Jacqueline, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself just a little bit?
Hi, I am Jacqueline. Kushiel's Dart was my first novel, and it was released in 2001. I now have been informed, and it must be true because marketing materials say so, that I am a cult favorite author. So I have a new book coming out that will kind of return to this milieu of terre d'ange that I think we're going to be spending some time talking about.
Absolutely. And why don't you tell us about it's Cassiel Servant, right? What is the inspiration behind it and kind of the idea?
For readers who are familiar with the Kushiel's Legacy series, all I have to say is it's Kushiel's Dart from Jocelyn's point of view. For the readers who have not discovered this world, this is a return to the setting that I created actually over 25 years ago, when you count in the writing of the first novel before it was released. People would ask, would you ever think about telling the story from this perspective, that perspective? Jocelyn's was very much a favorite. Going from a protagonist who is an divinely ordained masochist, if you will, to a utterly stoic, celibate warrior priest.
And I believe that Cassiel Servant is only going to cover the first book. Is that right?
Yeah.
In one of your Facebook posts, you said you didn't know if you would continue the rest of the series, especially because of, I guess, Cassiel's avatar and the Darsanga, I'm guessing.
Yes. It's largely that. That is a book that goes to, it's kind of, for me, the mirrors the Chekhov's gun. If you show it in the first act, it's got to go off before the end of the third. The notion of my protagonist as someone who is sort of literally capable of bearing the pain of the world. Well, then you gotta go far into the darkness. And not, I think that part would actually be more difficult to write from Jocelyn's point of view. But after that, also, his arc is kind of one of diminishing returns. At the end of Cassiel Servant, we see him leaping from the ramparts into battle. And the latter half of Kushiel's Avatar, he rows a boat for a really long time.
So I have to tell you that Kushiel's Avatar is actually my favorite of the three. It is the one that I reread most often, because despite the darkness of Darsanga, despite all of that terror, I think what really sticks with me is how much, if you can make it through it, there is the promise of healing.
Yeah.
And I guess, like, Jocelyn's healing in that story would also be interesting to me, like, to me at least. But yeah, I mean, I've read all of your books, so.
Yeah, it's not that it's with an idea without interest. I haven't abandoned the possibility by any means. But just in dramatic terms, interior drama is not what my fan base is generally buying anyway, I guess.
I guess. Although I did very much enjoy as well the Bainreker duology with those two books, and Starless as well, which I guess both have got a lot more internal going on. At least it felt like they had more internal going on.
Starless, I would say so. The Sundering duology, maybe not as much, because their actions are so prescribed by the formulae that I'm attempting to invert.
Yeah. So to go on to a topic of world building and the Kushiel series, What inspired you to create the world of Terra d'Ange in the Cassiel's Legacy series?
There were kind of 3 points of inspiration, one of which I often forget about because it was a dream. But I did write a short story based on it called The Martyr of the Rose. Oh, cattail.
Yeah, he wants to say hello, as he always does.
So I had this intense dream of roses blooming at the feet of this character. That was part of the inspiration, a trip to the south of France, where I just had a really wonderful trip, fell in love with the quality of the light, the scent of lavender in the air, all of the things that are evoked in Terre d'Ange have their roots in an actual Provence. And the other was I basically got paid to do a lot of the research that went into the theology. In the mid-90s, that was when angel lore was very, very popular. And I had a friend who worked for a packaging company that did coffee table books.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother would always say, why don't you just write a book on angels, honey? That'll, people buy that. And my friend called me one day. She's like, I'm headed into a pitch meeting and I got nothing. Got a 60-second pitch for me? I'm like, yeah, angels, only with a narrative nobody's done before. And so a lot of the theology that I was diving into was for this project, which was just a work for hire, but still my first major published thing. So all of those formed a gestalt at some point.
I mean, let's spawn from there into the religion. Obviously, it was very inspired by angels and so on. Did you ever, I mean, did you worry that you'd get pushback? I guess you went with an old history that has a Christ figure in a very different light.
Yeah, to some degree. I mean, there are elements that could receive pushback on so many levels. Certainly that's one. And I have had Jewish friends say, did you really have to do that? I'm like, wait till book 3. The tribe of Dan.
Yeah. When you did this, when you created this alternative Earth, why did you choose to use an alternative Earth rather than, say, a completely different world with the history just inspired by Earth's cultures? Like, I guess a very famous example of doing exactly that is, of course, George Martin, who did, well, precisely that with Game of Thrones. Like, it is the history of the Civil War.
Mostly just, I love history.
Yeah.
And a lot of the research that went into that was so fun to pick and choose elements that I was going to utilize. So I do think of it as alternate historical fantasy rather than squarely in the realm of epic.
Yeah. That being said, I mean, I would argue that it is still epic. It's just alternative history.
Yeah. That's why I said squarely in the realm.
Yeah. I noticed, by the way, the other day when I was looking at my copy of Kushiel's Dart, that it had been blurbed by Robert Jordan. Did you know him? Was that just the agencies?
I did not know him, and I think it was through Tor Books.
Okay.
I assume he actually did read it and did that as a kindness, paying it forward. I know they were very happy to have that blurb at the time. But that also reflects the thinking of situating it in epic fantasy. Yeah.
Can you discuss kind of your research process around this? You said you visited France and you fell in love. Did you, I recently, well, not recently, a couple of years ago, I went to Italy and I actually visited Lucca, which of course plays into the Imriel trilogy. Did you go to Luca? Did you travel to Africa for the Avatar stuff, or what is your research process?
It depends on availability of time and funds, basically. Where at this point, I've probably physically been to maybe half of the locations. Luca is not one of them. I haven't been any further in Africa than the north area, but you can extrapolate sometimes. So for Nama's Kiss, I actually was able to go to China, and the landscape became so much more of a factor than it would have if I hadn't been there physically researching and doing travel. And at one point I was in the midst of these karst limestone formations, and my partner just kind of turned at me and said, "You're using this, right?" Uh-huh. Yeah. But Luca's one I have not been to.
I was there. I was there actually for work, but I actually went a little bit out of my way to spend a night or two in Luca to actually go and see the walls.
Mm-hmm.
And they're amazing. It actually is amazing. You can, there's a trail you can run on the top of the walls that's about 8 kilometers long.
Wow.
So, yeah, highly do recommend.
Yeah, I'd love to. I've only seen photos.
Yeah.
But as far as process, at this point, once I have kind of an itinerary in mind, then I can determine how much is going to be book research and how much is going to be physical research.
Once you've got an idea of like the places where you're going and so on, and you're researching into the history and so on, how do you decide what you're going to change and what you're going to keep? Like, you changed England quite a lot. You kept it under Pictish rule, so there was never a Germanic invasion of England. The Angles never went there. The Romans presumably never went there. I think the Romans are the Tiberians, right? If I remember correctly.
The Roman, yeah, the Tiberians, yes, they were there, and then they buggered off more quickly than they did in our timeline.
Mm.
One of my readers called it cafeteria style, and honestly, that's probably the best description, because some of it isn't intentional. Like when I decided Carthage was never destroyed, did I know how that was going to play out at the end of what is it? Kushiel's Mercy? Yeah, Imriel's trilogy. No. I went, oh, Carthage, that could be interesting. Then as I've continued writing, I have to reckon more with those decisions that I've made and be more mindful about it. And it's funny, somebody made some reference to colonialism, and I'm like, oh yeah, colonialism, bad me, writing from the colonizer point of view. And then I thought, wait a minute, I kind of eliminated that. And so I was very mindful of it when writing Morin's trilogy, when we do go to Terra Nova, and determining things like guns, germs, and steel. What was it? Germs, hands down.
You changed quite a lot of the part of the world I'm from. I'm from Finland, and the while you can see that the kind of Scandinavian peninsula going on in the Scaldi, they also didn't go on. It doesn't look like the Viking raids happened.
Well, you've got the Master of the Straits, so yeah. I cannot. That's not an angle I really explicitly considered, but I figure a giant sentient angelic whirlpool being probably covers over a multitude of anachronistic sins. Or
No, for sure. I was just curious, like about the process of that kind of decision of deciding that this goes, this stays, and so on. So some
Yeah.
of it's just like this would be cool, and some of it, I'm guessing is in the service of the story.
Yeah.
For me, one of the defining traits of the Terre d'Ange series and of the Terre d'Ange world is definitely the religion. And I guess, things that stick with me from the religion is the as you put it in the third book, is the hard truth that lies at the center of love. Do you want to talk a bit about like how spirituality entered the books, what you were, portraying there, and what your kind of inspiration around that was?
It's a lot to articulate. There's some element that I was just using as pure story. These are the stories that are familiar to us. These are the religions of the world, or a number of them that I'm utilizing, and a number that no longer exist. Some of it was just kind of an interesting attempt to create a merge of the chthonic earth deity with the sort of celestial, autocratic, male-oriented deity of monotheism. And it kind of grew as the series went on, to encompass that idea of there are many different paths to the top of the mountain, but they all get to the top of the mountain.
Yeah. Okay, so magic. So obviously, our world doesn't have magic unless you kind of consider science, I guess, and so on. So how much work do you put into, like, how much change does magic make to the world? How do you include that and still keep a semi-realistic kind of our history timeline?
One of the points of inspiration behind this was listening to an interview, somebody who had done a new translation of the Iliad, and talking about how we think if, it says that Apollo raised up the hair on the back of Achilles' neck. Don't quote me on that. That might be wrong. That's just a metaphor. But actually, as it was written, it was meant to be a literal truth that there was a divine presence incarnate on the battlefield. So all of the magic in Terre d'Ange does stem from the theology or mythology that predominates, and that it got more extensive as the series went on, kind of simply because I swung so big for the fences from the gate. I kind of had to keep upping the ante. But at its base, it always stems from the belief systems. And I think that's part of what helps keep it rooted and grounded and feel less like so much fantasy. It's just D&D games. The gods are characters with these powers, and the mortals have these powers. And I really want to evoke the numinous sense.
Yeah. Your magic system as such is I guess fairly soft-ish. You don't really go for like the Brandon Sanderson kind of hard magic system. Would I be right in saying that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't actually read Brandon Sanderson, but I assume since he was chosen by Robert Jordan to complete Wheel of Time, that it's of that ilk.
Yes, so he's got a very he very much writes hard magic systems, with definitive rules that are treated almost as science kind of idea. Did you ever find that you wanted more rules in your soft magic system, or did it work for you that you just sort of went on what felt right? Did you put in place a kind of a system, or?
No, there is no system.
Okay. I just thought I'd ask.
I'm also, I'm not an organizer or a gamer by nature. So I know some people will have elaborately thought out maps and, I'm sorry, Scandinavia, yeah, you kind of got screwed. You got lumped into one big peninsula because you weren't part of the story. And I'm a shitty cartographer. And of course, they got a better map, and I said, no, but feel free to make a better map. And they said, we'll use the fucking sucky map you made.
I don't actually mind. Finland technically isn't part of Scandinavia, but it doesn't really matter.
Yes.
So,
whole different language group. My partner has a godchild.
The most interesting thing about our language is that Tolkien used it as inspiration for Elvish.
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah, but the corollary to that is that we have a word in the language that means the distance that a reindeer can go before it needs to pee, because this was a very important distance to our reindeer herding ancestors, because reindeers have to stop in order to pee, and that occasionally it's a source of amusement to me to think about Tolkien having this in his notes somewhere on, the glories of the Elvish language and the distance a reindeer needs to go before it needs to pee. So how do you handle kind of the setup where you introduce readers to something that is both familiar and yet strange? Because I guess like things like Carthage surviving is actually quite a big change, because it also changes the trajectory of the Roman Empire quite a lot, right? Obviously. So how do you handle that kind of introduction to the reader of these new, familiar and yet not? Do you ever get kind of pushback of like, but it couldn't be this way?
I haven't experienced that personally. I think because I'm writing historical fantasy, there's a fair amount of latitude allowed. But I know I may just have been lucky as well. I remember talking to Juliet earlier, who had people furious at her for not acknowledging that there's a coastal river off the Scottish Isles that in 1899, I don't know, some little detail that was wrong.
Sometimes it amazes me. It's just people will swallow dragons, magic, like all kinds of things. But then you're like, and also this cultural things change, and they're like, no, that is a bridge too far. You can't change. It's like, what?
I have to admit, the only time I felt that myself was when the state of Vermont wanted one of its lakes to be declared a Great Lake. And all of the state of Michigan, which is surrounded by the lakes known as the Great Lakes, was like, oh, hell no. I can see across it. It's not a Great Lake.
So how do you do that kind of introduction, or did you ever think about, did you do that kind of consciously, introducing the reader to like what has changed specifically and then glossing what hasn't, or how do you do that kind of thing?
That wasn't an issue that was of concern to me. Maybe because I enjoy reading alternate historical fantasy. So you kind of know going in, it's drawing on elements of our world and timeline, but it's also not. And I didn't feel the need to make that. I don't think it was a hard transition.
No, well, I mean, I wouldn't say so, but then, I've read the books enough that I know their history inside out. So do you have advice for authors who are looking to create these kinds of alt history worlds?
Obviously, travel to the extent that your time and budget allows for it. when you can't, if you're working in historical fantasy, I like to find the oldest source material I can to get as much distance in terms of description, but also there are tricks of the trade for me. Children's books. You want to know something about, like life in a medieval castle. And it's going to be 18 pages long, and you're going to be like, I know everything but that one thing. So those can be a really surprisingly good resource when they're well researched. Travel guides also are good.
I guess when is Cassiel Servant coming out, and what are you working on next?
It comes out August 1st. What I'm working on now is to be determined.
Okay. And I guess, do you have like closing thoughts around writing fantasy, world building?
Writing Cassiel Servant was really interesting in terms of world building, because I've created a world that is so known for opulence and decadence, and to write it from the point of view of a character who cares for these things not at all is a really interesting exercise. I would recommend it as a thought exercise, just to get out of your own head, and if you're working with a single protagonist. Economics, when you think about economics, think about a really basic level. In US with our terrible Medicare system, you really shouldn't opine on it if you don't have at least one friend who's missing a tooth and can't afford to have it fixed. Those are the kinds of questions that we should ask in our daily life, but also that you would ask in creating a world. And maybe it is dentistry. The things like that are really prosaic do need to be considered to make your world feel fully fleshed out and well-grounded without getting overwhelming detail. A little note or two keeps it real.
It was always interesting to me in the Kushiel, in the original Kushiel series, how the Court of the Night Blooming Flowers worked, in terms of its actual economics, in terms of raising children from the age of 10 and all of the kind of debt that goes associated with that. Did you kind of take inspiration for that from a specific place, or how did you come up with that kind of, I guess, economics of sex?
It's hard to answer a how-to question. I did.
Yeah. I guess.
Well, I didn't want it to be a single uncomplicated transaction. Wanted to keep an element that reminds us that this practice is sacred in Terdange. So making the system as elaborate as it was meant to reflect that it is a different ethos.
Yeah. Okay, that has been an interview with Jacqueline Carey. So you should all go and purchase your copies of the Kushiel series if you don't have it, in preparation for Cassiel Servant coming out.
Perfect.